I used to do a series on my channel called The Real Life, and the way The Real Life worked is I would look at zombie maps and I would try to see where Treyarch pulled inspiration from real life and then brought it into their zombie maps. You can see it on a map like Deriz, where many of the things within the map are actually based on real life conspiracy theories. This was a series I ran for several episodes, but after a while just ran out of content and things to talk about. But I decided to bring back this series. When talking to Jason Blundell, one of the things he said is they like to sort of add depth to the zombie maps, and that's where they'll start to pull in real life mythology or real life lore and conspiracies to make the map more interesting and make it less surface and give it a bit more depth. And so I've decided to re-explore a lot of the real life references within zombie maps, and this is going to be different from the original series. Rather than it be me saying this is something that existed in real life and now it's in zombies, what we're going to be doing is looking at more just references to real life, or the inspiration and what goes into a lot of the setting behind zombie maps and why things are the way they are. So it's going to be a little bit less concrete, but I think it should still nonetheless be interesting. We're going to start today with Kino der Toten. There is no real life Kino der Toten. You're not going to find a theater in which the Germans throughout World War II used for all sorts of crazy experiments. That simply does not exist. However, there is a lot of German history and a lot of film history that has been infused into Kino der Toten, and it's pretty fun to explore. We need to begin with the period known as the Weimar Republic. This period is basically from the end of World War I up until the beginning of World War II. This period was plagued with a lot of political instability as well as economic downturn. However, there was a period from 1924 to about 1929, just before the Great Depression, that was considered the golden age of the Weimar Republic. Very similar to, say, the Roaring Twenties that we saw in the United States leading up to the Great Depression. During this time period, the German film industry was booming. It was the second largest film industry in the world, only behind Hollywood. But in many ways, German films were pushing boundaries that American films were not. They were Hollywood's biggest competition, and German expressionism was everywhere. This was a large part of their film. Even today, when many students study film, they will also study the golden age of German film and Berlin's sort of booming film industry, because it was that influential on the time on film as a whole. Now, during the Weimar Republic, Bauhaus was a very influential style of architecture, and what Bauhaus does was much more minimalist, much more resource efficient, and it was always trying to give furniture and decorations and architecture not just a good look, but also a purpose. It was thought to be more modern and less gaudy. However, at the very same time, because the German film industry was booming, there was a lot going on within the theaters, and there was a lot of money being infused into them. So they started to become very lavish and very gaudy, and anybody would go at any time. The theaters in themselves were beautiful and they were very well decorated, and this makes sense why when you look at a map like Kino der Toten, the map is gorgeous. You go into the spawn room and there are golden statues which run the walls. Well, it doesn't quite fit with the architecture of the Weimar Republic. It does very much fit with the style of the German theaters, where they were very lavish. Eventually, like most good things, the boom of the German film industry did come to an end. This was with the crashing of the US economy in 1929, the Great Depression, which then caused the German economy to crash, which then caused many theaters to go under within Germany. You see, not many people had as much money, which means they went to the theater less, and this really crippled many German theaters, and a lot of them started to struggle after the Golden Age, 1929. And this probably caused the theater that Kino der Toten was to go under, and this is why Kino der Toten is an abandoned theater. You see, when you think about just having a map in a German theater, it does sound random, but it's not actually as random as you might think when you consider the great history that is behind the German cinema. You can't talk about modern cinema without talking about the golden age of Berlin's film industry. So that's where Kino der Toten itself comes from, and the idea of using an abandoned theater. Now, what about many of the movies that are on the wall within Kino der Toten? I assume many of them are fake for copyright reasons, and I suspect this because of the film on the wall, Pygmalion, or however you pronounce it. You see, this is not a film that exists, or at least existed at the time. There have been many adaptations. This is actually a Greek legend. The legend goes that a man actually built a statue of a woman out of ivory, and eventually he fell in love with this statue, and the gods turned this statue into a real person. When you read the description of it on the poster and translate it from its German version, basically what it says is a man had created the woman and he gave her free will. So he created a woman and brought her to life. She's no longer a statue. Now this is just a reference to that Greek story. However, when you look at the art and you look at the lighting, it's very similar to the poster for the famous German film Metropolis. Metropolis is the first ever, or not the first ever, but one of the first ever dystopian films. When you think about modern science fiction and modern dystopian films, it all traces its roots back to Metropolis. It is one of the most influential films of all time, and I believe that they are referencing this film with this poster by having this robotic statue-like woman in the center, much like the Metropolis poster, and the lights which shoot up from the bottom, much like in the Metropolis poster. So that's probably what's going on here with this poster. As for Faust, Faust is just a classic German legend. It tells the story of a man who made a pact with the devil in order to have all sorts of worldly wisdom as well as worldly pleasures, and eventually this deal with the devil ends up biting you in the butt. The reason they chose Faust for this is most likely because 1, it's in the public domain, 2, it's a classic German legend, so it might make sense if somebody makes a film adaptation of it at that time, and 3, the Faust or the devil also thematically fits in with zombies. The final film is Die Bismarck, and Die Bismarck is interesting because it's the first mistake that Treyarch made when setting the scene for Kino der Toten. You see, the film Die Bismarck is most likely a film about a German warship named Die Bismarck. You can tell because there are several sailors, there's a boat on the poster. However, the Bismarck was built in 1940, and Dr. Maxis was doing work in Kino der Toten in 1940, which means that this film had to have been made before 1940. However, before 1940, the ship did not exist, so if you could imagine, this does not make sense, and it would be impossible for somebody to make a film about a ship that does not exist. This is the first sort of time period mistake that Treyarch makes in Kino der Toten. The next one you can discover when you go outside of the map. So when you look outside, you see the Berlin Wall, which fits with the time period. Kino der Toten is set in the year 1963. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. However, you can also see Die Fernsehturm in the background, which is the German television tower. This began construction in 1965 and was completed in 1969. So there's no way this tower would have been built. It wasn't even decided or commissioned until 1964. So if you really wanted to be accurate, then the tower in Kino der Toten is wrong and should not actually be there, but we're gonna let that one slide. The final bit of real-life lore hidden inside Kino der Toten is Manhattan Down. You can find this spelled on the floor. This is really interesting. Manhattan Down isn't something you can actually find in real life. However, it's most likely a reference to the Manhattan Project, which of course is the group that had developed the first atomic bomb. Now, the interesting thing about the Manhattan Project is that many of the members within the Manhattan Project were suspected to be members of Majestic 12, and within the zombie storyline, they were some of the people that had originally worked with and messed with Element 115. So that's probably what they're referencing there. When they put down Manhattan Down on the floor, it's most likely an allusion to Majestic 12, which at the time was a pretty important and mysterious part of the zombie storyline. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real-life Kino der Toten. Those are all the references and history and lore and conspiracies that they infused into Kino der Toten. In some ways, Treyarch tried to set a map in Cold War Berlin within a theater that was most likely built during the Golden Ages, and just got it wrong on a few details, but you can let it slide because there's still a lot of really cool and interesting German history that makes Kino der Toten such a fun and interesting setting for a zombies map. Anyway, I'm gonna go. My name is John, and this has been the real life Kino der Toten.